Have you ever gone fishing with someone who always seems to know the exact right fly to tie on? It's like a superpower, like they can read the trout's mind or something. These anglers just pull up to the river, grab some flies out of their box, and start catching fish. Are they just lucky, or is there an actual method to their madness? On today's show, I'm going to teach you the skills that you need to be just like those other anglers. We're going to move beyond the basics and take a look at some of the more in-depth, advanced tactics that will help you always have the right fly on no matter where you're fishing.
This is Untangled, Fly Fishing for Everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company.
Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant, back in Wyoming, thankfully this week, where I belong. And this week, we are going to talk about those anglers, those lucky sons of guns, who just waltz to the river like they own the place, grab any random fly from their box just by the fistful, and proceed to catch every daggum fish in the water. I'm sure we've all been fishing with folks like that, right? It seems like no matter what they tie on or what fly they use, they just catch fish. And it seems like they always know what fly to tie on. That's the other thing, is you rarely see these folks guessing at what fly they need to use. And that concept dovetails very nicely with the most common question that we get here at VFC and at Untangled, which is, how do I know what fly to use? Or how do I pick the right fly? And that's a valid concern because unlike in spin or bait fishing, for example, fly fishing puts an enormous emphasis on it using imitations of aquatic insects that the fish are actively eating. We're not just throwing bait out there. We're not just smashing a worm onto a hook or bread or power bait or chicken liver or whatever it is that you're using to catch those fish. We're not just chucking it on there and hoping for the best, right? And I'm not knocking bait fishing, by the way. It's just that's kind of the concept of bait fishing, right? You throw it out there, you think, oh yeah, this will attract the fish, but you're not really doing anything else beyond that. Whereas with fly fishing, you're actively trying to slip into the natural world and fool a trout into thinking that your fly is real. And that comes with a lot of work that you got to do behind it. But that also inevitably brings us back to the topic of picking the right fly. We have an enormous amount of time and resources that we've dedicated to this topic. We've done masterclass videos just on this. We've done podcast episodes. I think we've done at least 2 about picking the right fly. And I know we bring it up often. It's because it's so important, right? We've even got an ebook, a free ebook all about picking the right fly, and that's linked in the podcast description if you care to check it out. But what all those resources, all those teaching moments have in common is that they're all on the basics. They're all entry-level stuff. It's all, okay, here you go. Here is how to pick the right fly. We're going to show you how to do it, and we're going to give you a formula to follow, and then, all right, we're done. Well, that's great. That's a fantastic way to start out. But I want to take us beyond those basics today. I want to move us from the entry-level stuff to maybe the next step, right? I want us to be able, after we finish the show today, to be like those anglers we joked about at the beginning of the show in the open, where it feels like they just, not only can they just pick any fly from their box and catch a fish, but it seems like they just instinctively know. It's just innate somewhere in their head, right? That they know what fly to tie on. How do you get to that point as an angler? Well, it's actually possible, right? But before we get into that, I do want to make one point very clear. Our right fly formula that we teach here at VFC, it's 100% foolproof. And it is the absolute best way for new anglers to learn how to pick the right fly. And for those who don't know, our right fly formula simply says that if you want to pick the right fly, if you want to always be able to have the right fly on no matter what you do is you go out to the river and you take a minute, you look at what's in the air, what's on the water, or what's in the water, right? That could involve picking up a rock and looking at what's underneath the rock. And by looking at the bugs that are already out there, by looking at the bugs that the fish have access to eat, then you open your fly box and you pick a fly based on matching the size, shape, and color of the natural flies that you found in the water or on the water or that you saw the fish eating. Okay, and those points are listed in order, right? Size is most important, and then shape, and then color is least important. And if you do that, if you match size, shape, color, you use the right fly formula, you pick a fly out of your box, you put it on, you get a good presentation, chances are you're going to be tying into trout pretty quick, right? That's a foolproof way to do it. But do you have to follow that every time you go to the river? And if that's so effective, and it is, if it's such an effective way to fish, then why don't guides or anglers who've been doing this forever follow it to the letter, right? And then specifically, how do those guides always seem to have a fly in their box that works so well, right? What I'm explaining today, it doesn't replace that right fly formula. That's the building block. That's the foundation for picking the right fly. That is the very basic information we have to know. You've got to be able to observe your surroundings, realize what the fish are eating, and pick a fly based on that. That is a critical skill. It's also why it's what we teach to beginners first, because without that building block, it's going to be tougher to really delve into what we're getting into today. What we're getting into today doesn't replace the right fly formula at all. It just adds to it. It's giving you more information so you can become even more effective at this whole process of picking the right fly, because I know it can be extremely daunting. I remember once, this was 10 years ago, maybe even more than that. No, it had to have been more than that. It was probably 15 years ago. I was out on a lake with a couple of buddies, and there were a bunch of people fly fishing this lake. And I don't even remember what I had tied on, but you could see the fish like porpoising up out of the water. So they were eating some kind of an emerger. I had no clue what an emerger was at this point in my life, but I remember hearing some of the guys on the bank, some of the fly anglers talking to each other like, oh yeah, they're eating damselfly nymphs or little damselfly emergers or something along that lines. And they kept using the word damselfly. And I'm like, what the heck's a damselfly, right? Like, I have no idea what they're talking about. And I wasn't paying attention to what was in the water. I wasn't even looking at what the fish were eating. I was just throwing the kitchen sink at the lake and trying to figure it out. And that just didn't work. That didn't help. That I wasn't able to actually catch many fish that day. It was kind of frustrating. But there were a few anglers who I noticed just walked down to the lake. They didn't say anything. They didn't talk to anybody else. They just quietly, I didn't see them look at the water. I didn't see them do anything. They just pulled their box out, tied a fly on, and got into catching fish, right? So what are those anglers and the guides and the other anglers? What have they done to get to that point? Well, I'm going to call this group the highly experienced anglers. And what they've done is obviously they've moved past the beginner phase of fly fishing. They're no longer a beginner. They've moved up in the sport a little bit. And as they've done that, they've started to understand the seasonality of fly fishing, that everything that happens in this sport is dictated by the season, by the weather, and by the whims of Mother Nature, right? You have to understand that because the seasons, Mother Nature, that all impacts the food that's available at any given time to the trout. So what those highly experienced anglers have done, what they've achieved is a deep understanding of not just how to pick the right fly, but why to pick the right fly, right? They understand the why behind it. And that's like the building block of what we teach here at VFC is learn the why and you will succeed, right? They've learned the why. And that's where I want to get us on the show today. I want to get us to understanding that why. You're going to have all the tools you need to take your observational skills that you've acquired by using the right fly formula and level those up so that you have a much better ability to pick the right fly, right? This is going to work no matter where you fish across America at the very least. I haven't I fly fished in Canada. That's the only place outside of the U.S. that I've fly fished. So I don't know if this holds true for Europe, but at least across America, right, this stuff's going to work. And you're going to have confidence in knowing that you have the right flies to catch trout. And I've put all of this information that we're going to talk about today into a year-round hatch guide that's linked in the podcast description so you can refer to it whenever you need. There's a little link down there. Just go click and call it good. But to get to this point, right, to truly level up your ability to pick the right fly. There are 4 key concepts you have to understand. And these are what those anglers at the lake understand. This is what the guides understand. This is what those people who just walk to the river and catch fish immediately understand, right? And these are not in order of importance, right? These are just in the order that they came out when I was putting the show together for you this week. So the first one is time of year. Remember, I talked about how important seasonality is in fly fishing and understanding that. Well, trout rivers and the bugs that live in them, they are actually some of the most reliable things in nature, because just like the elk rut, we have a lot of elk here in Wyoming, or a bear's hibernation. We actually have a lot of bears too, come to think about it. But just like the elk rut or a bear's hibernation, hatches occur at roughly the same time every single year. That's largely true whether you live in the Rockies or on the East Coast or in the Midwest somewhere. You might give or take a couple weeks on either end of a hatch depending on the weather, right? Your blue wings might start late or they might start early, just depending on how warm it gets. But generally, they're going to happen the same time every year. So that's one thing to understand, is you have to understand that your hatches are going to happen at a certain time every year. This is also where local knowledge of your fishery comes into play, because the anglers who know what to tie on before they even get to the water are the ones who spent considerable time on that water, right? They know it. They understand it. There's nothing that's going to replace knowledge of your river, and that just comes with time. But if you're headed somewhere new to you, then I highly recommend checking some recent fishing reports to get an idea of where at in the hatches some rivers are. For example, I've already got a ton of yellow sallies and caddis hatching on one of my favorite tailwaters, but on another one that I love to fish, just a few hours away, not very far away, none of the bugs have really started hatching yet this year. The water's is still a little too cold, but that underscores the point that timing is important. And the more knowledge that you can gain about timing, the better off you'll be, right? With all that said, the schedule, I'm going to lay out a schedule for you guys here. And this is really when the bugs hatch, okay? For most trout water in America, this schedule is going to work. Again, you might need to give or take a couple of weeks, but understanding that, all right, I'm at this time of year, and these are the bugs that should be coming off, you just go to the river and you tie on, all right, it's mayfly time. All right, here's a mayfly nymph. Boom. It's that simple. You move beyond that right fly formula of matching everything to just, hey, mayflies should be on the water. I'm going to tie that on today, right? And again, this is all summarized in our year-round hatch guide that's linked in the podcast description for you. But we'll start out with our midges, okay? These bugs hatch year-round. Okay, if you are ever at a loss for what to tie on, a midge is a fantastic bet. These are going to hatch during winter, although you will need a warmer day for that hatch to occur during the winter, right? Next is our caddis. There are tons of different species of caddis. I ran into, I think there were 2 different species of caddis yesterday, actually. I was out on the water yesterday, and it blows my mind always how much variation there is in the caddis family. So some rivers might have a hatch of one species that comes off at a very certain time. Think like the Mother's Day caddis on the Madison, for example. And, Mother's Day caddis, it's called that because it usually comes off around that time of year. There's also an October caddis that's active in the fall. Generally speaking, though, your caddis are going to be active as both nymphs and adults from roughly May to October. So in that time frame, you're on the water between May and October, caddis is a pretty good bet to tie on. This is why when I go out nymphing sometimes, you're going to notice there's going to be overlap between a lot of these bugs too. Midges are hatching year round. If I'm going to nymph, let's say it's May, the water's a little high, I'll put a caddis nymph on and a midge nymph on underneath it because, hey, I know that those are both moving around at this point, and put them on. Put both on because they're active in the water at the same time. All right, our next fly. Again, you're going to see these everywhere. Blue-winged olives. These are my favorite mayflies. I love fishing the blue-winged olive mayfly hatch. It's usually the first really good hatch and then the last really good hatch of the season, so there's some sentimentality to it for me. It's why I love it so much. But with few exceptions, you can expect to find reliable blue-winged olive hatches where fish will readily eat tons of them from late March through early June. And then they kind of taper off in the summer. They're replaced by a different mayfly in the summer. And then they'll come back from September through early November. All right. And then you'll see them kind of die off again. But late March through early June, and then September through early November for your blue-winged olives. Next up is a small black or winter stonefly. I've heard it referred to by both names, but as the name implies, it's just a small black stonefly that hatches when there's still a fair amount of snow on the ground. And when I say small, I mean I saw some that were like a 14 this year on one of my local rivers. You can bet on this if you've got stoneflies in your area and stoneflies are in your local rivers. And if you don't know that, you can always do some research, ask fly shop, Google, talk to some folks. There's going to be a lot of information, but stoneflies are generally abundant. But this hatch is going to occur around February through April, depending on the weather, right? Next up, another stonefly, and this is the yellow Sally. It's a stonefly. It's a bit larger than some caddis. Usually they're, in the 10 to 12 range. 10's a little big. 12 to 14. They're a little bit bigger, but they're beautiful bugs. They've got a bright yellow body and then a bright red tail on them. They're just cool looking. And you're going to see those come off from late May through early July. Next up is going to be your drakes. These are the big boys of the mayfly family. They're not as big as the hexagenias, which you get out in the Midwest. But again, that's a localized hatch, so we're trying to go a little bit more broadly here. But the drakes are your big ones, okay? These are your green, your brownie, your gray drakes. They're very large. You can get them up to size 10. I've even seen them in size 8 before. They're just a big old mayfly, and you can count on them to be active from May through early July. That's when the drakes are going to be out. Next up is our pale morning duns. These are light cream-colored mayflies. They're very similar to sulfurs, and you're going to find them in June and July. That's the best time of year to look for them. Sometimes I've seen them coming off a little bit later, and I've also seen them come off a bit earlier in some places too, but I reckon that's more of a seasonal, regional specific issue here, and I don't know that that's terribly common with pale morning duns. Next up is our blue quills and mahogany duns, right? This is for those folks on the East Coast. This is localized over there because you'll find these more in the eastern waters, but there's enough folks over there on that side of the country that I couldn't just leave it out, right? But your quills and your mahogany duns, they're reliably going to hatch from early April to early May. But again, remember those are found in the eastern fisheries primarily. And last but not least, we've got Alex's favorite fly, the trico. These are tiny, tiny mayflies. They have a reputation for being obscenely difficult to fish, and you want to look for them from July through October. So, backing up, we've looked at some of the major flies that hatch. We've looked at when they hatch. You know that you've got all these things going on. So, if we take a 1,000-foot view of that information, midges hatch year-round. You want to focus on mayflies earlier, caddis from May to October, and then mayflies and midges again to end the year. However, as I'm sure you noticed, these hatches overlap, which leads us to the second concept to understand, which is the time of day. Because depending on when you're on the river, aquatic insects are likely going to be at different stages of their hatches. For example, green drakes on the Henry's Fork. They often peak mid to late morning, but obviously they can extend later sometimes. The blue wings on the lower Provo back when I lived in Utah, I could count on those, the spring version of them, reliably hatching from like 11 to around 3 or 4, depending on how prolific the hatch was. So I knew to schedule my college classes so I didn't miss too much of the hatch, and I did that. Some of you might be doubting me, but no, I did that. I actually got one of the professors, I talked him into playing hooky one day and coming with me. I'm not going to mention who because I want him to still have a job. But it was that good, it was that dependable that I could just go and do it, and I knew the time when it was going to happen. If I got to the river before that hatch started, then that was a fantastic time for me to fish some blue-winged olive mayfly nymphs while I was waiting for the duns to come out, which ties very well into concept number 3 that you have to understand, which is how hatches generally progress, or the progression of a hatch. The right fly formula, like I said, it's great because it's foolproof, But the one thing that it doesn't teach beginners is a lot about how a hatch progresses. Now, I could spend an entire masterclass video and an entire podcast episode just on that concept, but I'm going to cover it very briefly here. All right. Generally speaking, your aquatic insects hatch this way. They start out in the larva or pupa stage, depending on what they are. This is what we commonly refer to as the nymph. When we're fishing nymphs, we are imitating this very basic beginning stage of life for aquatic insects. And this is before they start to turn into the adult, which we commonly call the dun, right? Once they move past that stage, they get into what we call the emerger stage. This is the point where the aquatic insects, except for stoneflies, start to shed their nymphal bodies and they emerge into their adult version. And they're doing this all in the water. Stoneflies do it out of the water, however. At this point, they're emerging, they're shooting up through the water column to the surface, and they usually get stuck in that surface film. They're trying to dry their wings out. They're still getting rid of their nymphal shuck. They're trying to move around. So they're stuck in the surface film. They're very easy pickings for trout. Trout love them at this point. That's why there's so many different emerger patterns on the market. I love fishing emergers, specifically when you've got mayfly hatches going on. They'll really key in on that stage, right? They're stuck there. They're waiting to become the fully fledged adults so they can fly away and make more bugs, right? Once they've done that, once they've fully emerged, they're in the done or adult stage. The full-blown version of the bug, they're ready to go make more bugs for us so that we can keep fly fishing. And then after they've finished their bug business, they become spinners or spent wings. They'll be spent after mating and they'll fall to the river's surface during an event commonly called the spinner fall. Sometimes as they fall, they spin. Kind of like those, is it maple seeds that do that? You know, the little helicopter seed thingies. But that's where the name spinner fall comes from. Right at this point, the bugs are dead, so they're really easy trout food. Spinner falls can be just incredible fishing if you can get into them, which if you know when mayflies are coming out, boom, you can do that, right? So that's how our hatches progress. So you've got to understand, what's going to be in the water when you're going there, the time of day, so you get an idea of what stage of the hatch you're in, and then you've got to understand, okay, well, how does the hatch progress? So you know, all right, the hatch hasn't started yet. I'm going to throw some nymphs on or some emergers, right? Try and catch it before they really start coming off. And then the last thing that you're going to do, because this is really going to dictate everything that you do, because as much as we mythologize or hold up those folks who just know what fly to tie on, what they're doing and what they've done so much is that they've watched the fish and they know to let the fish tell them what to tie on, right? The fish will do an excellent job of telling you that. Just recently, I was on the water, and all day I've been fishing a hopper-dropper combo, and it was a big crawdad nymph on the bottom. And I was catching a lot of fish on that crawdad nymph. And then about 4 o'clock rolls around, and I start seeing a lot more bugs coming off the water, and they were smaller mayflies and some caddis. And the fishing just almost stopped for me. It was just dead. And I could see the fish. They were suspended, about a foot below the surface, and I could see them darting side to side, eating nymphs and emergers as they tried to shoot up to the surface and hatch. And they were just completely ignoring what I'd been catching fish on like an hour ago, right? It switched that quickly, okay? So you've got to watch the fish, watch their behavior. It's going to tell you what you need to tie on. Also, the way that they rise, that's going to tell you whether they're eating emergers or the duns. We've talked about this before, but generally an emerger eat when they're trying to get that fish that's stuck in the surface film. They're going to come up, and you're usually only going to see their dorsal fin and their tail fin break the surface. If they're eating the adults, you'll usually see their whole nose and head come up out of the water, right? So if you pay attention to how they're rising, that can help you decide, all right, well, they're eating emergers, they're keyed in on that, I'm going to tie that on and go to work. So by being roughly aware of what should be hatching based on the time of year and time of day that you're on the water, if you spend a few minutes watching the fish, you can know almost exactly what to tie on, okay? Whether you're looking under a rock or you're seeing the water or not, okay? You don't have to do that stuff. You can just anticipate what's going to happen next and start to fish it all as it happens. I've been able to do this a couple of times Going back to the lower Provo, right? Blue wing hatches on the lower Provo. I fished it so much and it was so predictable that I knew, okay, I'm going to get there at this time and I have my dry dropper on with a nymph underneath it. And I'm going to fish it until I start seeing emerger and I'm going to throw an emerger on. And then when the emergers start to finally peter off a little bit, I'm going to tie a spent wing on behind that. And I could kind of anticipate the changes in the hatch because I'd watched it and I was watching the fish and I knew the hatch well enough, right? As you commit all this information to memory, you'll find that it becomes second nature to just go to the river and tie on what the fish should be eating. And oftentimes they actually are. Now, I'm going to leave you with one caveat, right? And that is sometimes the fish don't cooperate. Sometimes they're going to throw you a daggum curveball that you got to deal with. If there are multiple bugs hatching at once, for example, then you're going to want to spend some extra time observing what's going on, right? A couple of years ago, I got into a great day on the Green River where there were caddis, yellow sallies, and mayflies all hatching at once. And I was like, well, what do I tie on? Because there were so many bugs. So I had to actually sit and watch the fish for a minute and see what they were actually eating. I actually ended up tying on a caddis and then a yellow sally in tandem. So I was fishing 2 dry flies because that's what they seem to be eating the most of. But watching and looking at the fish for a minute, very important lesson. And I want to make sure to remind you all that never doubt the evidence of your eyes, right? So if you show up to the river and you think, all right, I'm going to do this. Well, if the fish tell you something different, listen to the fish, right? Because at the end of the day, the best anglers I know, the folks who are the most successful at this, are the ones who are most observant, which at its core is what the right fly formula, and now this expanded process that we've talked about here, teaches you how to do. All right, folks, thanks so much for sticking with us through that. Coming up next, we've got the Q&A section for this week's show. Just a quick note for any new listeners or viewers before we dive into the Q&A section for this week's show, but Untangled runs on questions from viewers and listeners, right? That's what fuels everything we do here. Even the beginning of the show where I dive really deep on one topic, that's all fueled by questions that you send us. And then obviously the last half of the show is all Q&A based. The entirety of what we do here at VFC and at Untangled is based on answering your questions and helping you become a better angler. So if you've got any questions that you would like answered, please submit those. There's always a link in the podcast description, and I will get to those and get those answered as quickly and hopefully as informatively as I can. But, well, is informatively even a word? As a former English teacher, I should know that. You know what? We're going to roll with it. Shakespeare can make up his own words, and dadgummit, so can I. Oh, with that, folks, let's have Mike from Colorado lead us off with his question this week. He wrote in and said, quick question. I've been fly fishing for about 1 year now. My question is, I can cast my nymph rigs and streamers very well, but for some reason, I cannot cast my dry flies. I've tried smaller tippet and such, but just can't seem to get the casting down. Any suggestions? Well, Mike, thank you for the question. Appreciate that. First off, if you're having a tough time casting, I don't necessarily know that smaller tippet is going to be the best way to go, especially with dry flies. The reason for that is that smaller tippet, especially if you're trying to cast a bigger dry fly, let's say like a size 12 caddis, for example, it's going to be tougher if you are putting on 6 or even 7x tippet, because that tippet, when it gets down to that size, there's just not enough energy transfer to effectively move that big fly. It just makes it very tough to turn those bigger bugs over. A good rule of thumb is to divide the size of your fly by 3, and then you use that number to pick your tippet. So a size 12 caddis would need 4x tippet. So don't skimp on the tippet because you will notice some issues if you're doing that. But what this sounds like to me, your issue, obviously I don't know for sure because I'm not seeing you cast, but it seems like when you're casting nymph rigs or streamers, because you mentioned you do that a lot, you're used to getting the feedback from your fly rod on when you should move to the next casting stroke. Those heavier rigs, a nymph rig with an indicator and split shot on it, a couple flies, that weighs quite a bit, certainly weighs a lot more than a dry fly. Those heavier rigs, though, they load the fly rod up with a bit more energy, which can make it easier for you to feel the timing of each casting stroke, so you know when to move the rod back and when to push it forward. Dry flies, though, like we just said, they hardly weigh anything. So it can be tough to feel when your rod loads. We'll see if I can say that without tripping over myself. When your rod loads and is ready for the next casting stroke. Based on my time as a guide, I reckon you're probably moving the rod too fast with your dry flies on. That's the most common problem I saw with my clients who had trouble casting dry flies, and the most common problem I still see, honestly, when I'm teaching folks how to fly fish. The best advice I can give you is go to a park or somewhere that you've got some open space and practice your casting. Don't even tie a fly onto the end of it. Just get used to how it feels without a fly for a minute. And I want you to watch the entire fly cast, front and back strokes both. So you're going to be turned, looking up at it as you cast back and forward. Okay, I want you to watch everything, because if you spend a few minutes doing this, you're going to move the fly rod based on what you see, and then you're going to start to feel what that feels like without that extra weight of the nymph rig or the streamer on it. You're going to start to develop that muscle memory for your dry fly cast. You'll understand the rhythm for casting dry flies, and then hopefully with a little bit of practice, next time you get out of the water, you'll know, okay, I got to slow down just a little bit when I'm throwing these dry flies. Parker from Oregon's got our next question, writes in and says, what is the most effective woolly bugger color depending on the time of year? Well, Parker, thank you for that question. And I'm going to answer your question with another question. Does color even matter? Think about that for a minute. Everybody, I want you to think about it. Does color matter to your fly selection? It's in our right fly formula, size, shape, then color. But does it actually matter all that much? My personal opinion, based on my fly fishing experience, is that color matters even less than we already assume it does. And I know there's folks out there who are going to tell me I'm wrong, and that's fine. I'm wrong all the time. If you don't believe me, just ask my mother-in-law. She'll tell you. But I really don't know that color matters all that much. I don't have science. I don't have articles to back me up on this, but it's almost 2 months ago now, I was fishing a great blue-winged olive hatch, and I was catching all of them on a purple haze. A purple. That's not olive. It's not even close to olive green. It's purple, right? I just, how can I do that and have color matter as much as we think it does? I'm inclined to believe that it just doesn't, right? We discussed this on episode 78 a couple of weeks ago, that the contrast of colors is what matters a lot more than the actual color scheme itself of a fly. Give you an example of that. I was out last week. Yeah, it was last week. I was out, and I had two different colors of zertle bugs. I was fishing crawdad nymphs. It's a crawdad imitation. It looks ridiculous. Zertle bug. If you've never seen it, look it up. It looks like you let a 2-year-old just go to the hook, but it catches fish. It's such a good fly. I love them. But I was fishing them, and I had one that had a bright orange body with a dark strip of rabbit fur on top of it. So I had a lot of contrast to it. And I caught a bunch of fish on that one, and then a larger fish broke me off because I tied a bad knot, and it swam away with my fly laughing at me. And the only one that I had left was one that was basically the same color. It was a dark body with a dark rabbit strip on the back. So there was a lot less contrast, and I did not catch as many fish on that one. Now, that very well could have been because the time of day was changing, and they were moving away from the crawdads. They're focusing on all the caddis and stuff that were coming off. But that's not the only time that something like that has happened to me, where you lose the fly that it's not necessarily that it's the right color, it's the right amount of contrast. I think that's what matters more than anything else, is its contrast, right? So I'll get off my soapbox for a minute and directly answer your question, Parker. There's really not a color that's going to work better based on the time of year, especially for woolly buggers. Flies don't really work like that. The best rule of thumb, color-wise, is that if it's a dark day, you want to fish a dark fly, and if it's a bright day, you want to fish a bright fly. That's what everybody I know who fishes streamers does. It's the maxim that we all repeat for streamers. I don't necessarily understand why, but that's what we do, right? One other thing that I'd like to add too is that nothing will replace experimenting when you're on the water either. So just because we all say, well, dark days, dark flies, and bright days, bright flies, okay, well, that's a good rule of thumb. But if we know anything about fly fishing, is there's very few absolutes in this. So definitely don't be afraid to change it up. Try different things. Don't get stuck into thinking that it has to be this way and it's always this way and it's never going to change, because experimentation is the name of the game, right? Trying different things, learning different things. You watch anybody who fishes streamers a lot. If you watch Kelly Gallup on YouTube, he does tons of streamer videos. He's always changing the colors. He's changing his retrieve. He's changing the size until he finds something that works, until he finds the combination of what the fish are actually keyed in on that day. So thanks for letting me go on a little bit of a rant about color and contrast. I appreciate it. And hopefully that was a good answer to question, Parker. If you've got any more, please don't hesitate to reach back out. Our next question comes to us. Sarah wrote this in via emails. I don't know where Sarah's from. She wrote in and said, "Hi guys, first of all, thank you for all the podcasts and videos. They have helped me go from doubtful beginner to respected intermediate. I listen to podcasts on my way to a fishing spot and it jazzes me up. I have heard from guides, besties, seasoned crusty old men, and master anglers all different advice when it comes to changing up a fly. It ranges between, if you don't get a hit within the first few casts, switch it up, and keep at it, just change locations, which could mean hours with a fly that does nothing. My question is this: if I do not get hits within the first few ranges of casting, close, far, etc., then I usually stop, observe, flip rocks, and then switch and get back at it. I know there is no perfect answer because it's always different, but is there some basic rule of when to swap out what you have been using?" Sarah, thanks a bunch for this question. I love it. I love what you said about the show as well. Thank you so much for that. Appreciate it. And I love that you said it jazzes you up. I love that phrase. We don't use that phrase enough, right? I'm jazzed that you used jazzes me up. Your rule of thumb here sounds really solid. Get it, try casting throughout all the ranges, close, far, work the water, and then switch if you don't get anything on it. That's pretty solid, but I'm going to dig into your question just a little bit before I answer it directly. Presentation, and I've talked about this, I feel like almost every week, which is good. That's not a complaint, right? This is a lesson we've all got to learn, and not just beginners, but everybody. We have to remember this. Presentation is the most important skill you can master in fly fishing. A well-presented fly has a much better chance of catching trout than a poorly presented one, right? For your dry flies, to get a good presentation with a dry fly, that generally means getting a drag-free drift that doesn't line trout. What I mean by drag-free drift is, imagine you throw a leaf out on the water and you watch it go down the river. That leaf just floats and it lets the water move it around, right? It's not moving against the current at all. You want your flies to do exactly the same thing. They need to sit there and just let the current push them around. Now, if they start to move because they're being pulled one way or the other because your fly line and your fly are in different currents, then you're going to start to see a little wake on the end of your dry fly, and that's what we call drag. That's how you know that drag is there, right? That's what you want to do your best to eliminate. Now, lining, if you've got a few fish that are rising and they're chomping down on bugs, if you go and throw a cast and your fly line lands on top of those rising fish, there's a pretty good chance that's going to spook them and they're going to quit rising for a minute. That's what we mean by lining. You want to make sure your presentation works by just getting the fly and a little bit of leader and tippet over the fish instead of your whole fly line. So a good presentation with dry flies means a drag-free drift and not lining the trout. For nymphs, right, a good presentation means no drag, and you've got to get into the strike zone. Okay, with nymphs, if we're fishing them beneath an indicator, they can drag as well, especially if your indicator and your flies land in different uh, currents, different speeds of current that's moving around. The best way to make sure that you don't have any drag on that on your nymphs is to make sure that you're getting them all landing in the same current, and then pay attention to that indicator as it's moving. If it is dragging, if you see that little wake behind it, that means you've got drag on your nymphs as well. So you want to make sure you're drag free on your nymphs. But then you got to be into the strike zone. And for those who don't know, the strike zone is just the place in the water column where the fish are eating nymphs. Often it is down near the bottom. That's why we preach you got to get down to the bottom first, because the current's slower at the bottom. The fish don't have to work as hard, and there's tons of food down there. So they can just sit there, kind of be lazy, and just gobble up stuff as it drifts past them, like me at a buffet, right? It's fantastic. That's how you get fat, happy trout. Now, you've got to get down to that strike zone either with heavy flies or split shot or a combination of both. But you need to make sure, whether it's dry flies or nymphs, that you've done your absolute best to present them. Okay, get a good presentation. Because fly anglers fall back on that switch the fly crutch more often than any of us would like to admit. Because, well, oh yeah, I'm just going to switch the fly. And I'm guilty of it myself sometimes, right? Sometimes I don't always get the best presentation, okay? Sometimes I'll even want to start changing my fly the second I tie it on, because I tie it on and then I see something. I'm like, oh, I'm going to change it. And I'm like, no, I've got to stick with it just a little bit. Okay. So as a direct answer to your question, Sarah, the basic rule of swapping out flies for me is that when you feel you've presented your flies as best as you possibly can, and you haven't had any luck with it, then you can start switching them out. But you've got to make sure you've dialed that presentation in first, and you've put it in front of where you think fish are, or if you see them rising, you put it in front of rising fish, right? Once you've done that and they've refused it, and I would say, like, if you nymph one run and you nymph it beautifully and you feel so good about it, like, yeah, that was fantastic, and they just don't play ball, the fish don't cooperate, don't immediately switch yet. Give it a couple of runs, give it a couple of spots, give it a little bit of time, because maybe there just weren't fish in there. Maybe they just didn't want to play. They're fickle creatures, for crying out loud. We don't always know why they don't eat. So don't just immediately change if your presentations are perfect and you haven't caught a fish. Okay, give it a little bit of time. But I'm saying that if your presentations are great, you've done them as best as you can, and the fish still aren't playing ball, that's when I would start thinking about switching your flies out. I do tend to stick with my flies longer than I should. That's due from equal parts laziness and stubbornness, because I like to say, oh no, I know what to tie on, and I don't always know what to tie on. And it's funny too, because I know a ton of anglers, a ton of folks who are very, very good at this, and they switch their flies out constantly, so much more than I do. Some of the anglers I know will even switch their flies from one hole to the next because the fish might be keyed in on different bugs in different spots. Again, that's another reason why you shouldn't just immediately change after your presentations are good. Give it a little bit of time, work those flies for a bit before you start switching things out. But at its simplest, make sure you presented your flies as well as possible in all the strike zones before ditching them for another pattern. All right. Thank you so much, Sarah. I appreciate you sending that question in. And with that, folks, we have come to the end of yet another fantastic episode of Untangled. I am stoked that y'all stuck with us. I appreciate it so much. This show is an absolute blast to do, and I can't wait to come back next week. And in between now and next week, please rate and subscribe to the show if you haven't already done it. That helps more people see the show. That helps us be more visible, get more listeners, grow the show, and help more anglers have a great day on the water. And speaking of great days on the water, it's summer. Let's get out, get on the water, have a fantastic time. And until next week, everybody, tight lines.